In 1933, a ship was traveling across the Mediterranean. Its destination, Athens. On this ship were some of the most powerful architects in Europe, and they had gathered there to change architecture and urban design across the continent. This elite group of architects dictated how design should be practiced in the 20th century, and they are the reason we have minimum standards for the design of homes. They also created the holy grail of urbanism, one that would define the architecture and planning of industrial cities for years to come. So, why have you never heard of them? It might be because this group was riddled with politics, with power plays, and with acts of persuasion, and in the end, it became its own undoing. This is the story of how a group of designers came together to change the world. And guess what? They did. But was it for the better? Never before had the world seen such a powerful group of architects, and maybe nothing parallels it even to this day. But was it all just a facade? One that became evident on that ship? Today on Blessedarch, we are looking at the history of one of the most powerful group of designers. This is the story of the International Congress of Modern Architects. In the 1920s, in the world of architecture, there was a struggle going on. A struggle between the people who clung to the past, who wanted their architecture to be decorated, classically beautiful, and the modernists, who believed in new technologies and simpler masses which are devoid of excessive ornamentation and built to reflect the modern times of industrial efficiency. One of the biggest spokesperson for this was the architect Le Corbusier. Corbusier, for those of you who do not know, was a Swiss-French architect, designer, painter, urban planner, and writer. I want to stress on the writer part a bit more because it will come in handy later in this video. He was one of the greatest modern architects of the 20th century, and his work was an inspiration to the likes of B.B. Doshi, Louis Kahn, and Oscar Niemeyer. Now, Corbusier had an ambitious plan. He wanted to bring the whole continent together and create a society of modern architects, one which could debate together and define how architecture should be practiced in the 20th century. And in 1928, he formed this group, called the Congrès International des Architectes. I'll not try to pronounce the French name. In short, it was called CIAM. We're gonna stick to the English pronunciation for this, which was the International Congress of Modern Architects. This new organization from now on would be responsible for debating, formulating, and spreading the principles of the modern movement. There were a lot of incredible names that were a part of this group, including, of course, Le Corbusier, but also Walter Gropius, Karl Moser, Henrik Berlage, Victor Bourgeois, and many more. Of course, the group kept increasing over time and got more members like Minet de Silva, Alvar Aalto, Louis Herman de Koning, and more. Now, the raison d'etre, or the reason to be for this organization, was to standardize architecture across the continent and create uniformity for the betterment of the profession and the society at large. For this purpose, they worked on 3 different levels of scales and design: the unit level, the building level, and the city level. Not all of it was to be resolved in one go, but each time they met, they had the agenda of going one step further and refining their debates and guidelines. It all started from the very first CIAM meeting. Organized at the Château de las Sarraz in Switzerland, this meeting was focused on establishing in writing the need for the organization and defining certain basics for all architects and designers. These founding statements included things like: building is an elementary activity of man. Architecture should express the spirit of an era. And architecture has an economic and sociological task in the service of people. Now, these might sound like those regular mundane things that all architects say in different forms. But these statements were important, especially the second one. Architecture should express the spirit of an era. This was the whole reason Corbusier bothered to even start this group. He was sick of the kind of architecture he saw. He wanted away with the neoclassical styles from the excessive decorations. He wanted a new architecture that reflected this new era of industrialization, of factory workers. He often liked to compare the standardized efficiency of the motor industry with the inefficiency of the building trade. The document that the organization produced in that first meeting was called the La Sara's Declaration, and it asserted that architecture could no longer exist in an isolated state separate from governments and politics, but that economic and social conditions would fundamentally affect the building of the future. It also emphasized the need for the design and construction industry to rationalize their methods, embrace new technologies, and strive for greater efficiency. So these statements were not just random regular gibberish that people say, they were consciously chosen to declare to the world that its design was about to change. Now, before we move to the second meeting of Siam, we need a bit of historical context of what was happening in the world. This was a time just after World War I. Germany had of course lost the war and its economy had taken a beating. Of course, the Great Depression had also kicked in by this time. Adding to all the other challenges that the country was now facing, there emerged a housing crisis. In the year 1919, the Weimar Constitution was drafted for Germany and it guaranteed the right to a healthy dwelling for every German. But with limited resources and funds, how do you achieve that? For a long time, the European countries had seen the emergence of the factories, which meant that many people now lived near them for work opportunities. But because of a lack of any sort of standard on the built environment, these new dwellings often became dark, dingy, and dirty. People knew how to build big, fancy family houses, but not many people cared for how people who could not afford them lived. So how exactly do you define a healthy dwelling for every individual? A definition that is not dependent on their economic status. The answer came with a bit of political motivation behind it. A brand new approach to housing was being studied, and the solution Germany came up with was called existence minimum. Literally, it translates to subsistence dwelling, but what it really meant was a dwelling where every user gets a minimum space for all their vital functions and gets access to natural resources like water, fresh air, and sunlight. And all of these built within the minimum levels of income. By the way, even though this term originated in Germany, the philosophy behind it had been in play before this time as well. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, collective housing models such as Dom Kommuna were tried out in the Soviet Union, with a particular focus on optimizing the domestic space and emphasizing the sense of community through a scientific approach towards design. Now, the key word here is a scientific approach. For the first time, people were thinking to incorporate science and research into determining the best way to house people. And that brings us to the second meeting of Siam. Held in Frankfurt in the year 1929, Siam 2 had a clear agenda to work on the minimum standards for architecture. Now, as I told you, the organization would work on 3 different levels: unit level, building level, and the city level. Well, at this meeting, they mainly focused on the first one, the unit level. For this, the architects who were present in the meeting had been conducting extensive research. This was the first time such a comprehensive study was presented on dwellings. This had data from individual building projects proposed by Siam members, like the Wells and Coates Iscon Flats in Hampstead, Josep Louis Sert's Casa Block in Barcelona, and Sven Markelius's collective house in Stockholm. All of these case studies were analyzed to answer one simple question: how much space did people need? Also, at the same time, mass production was all the rage with modern architects, so they wanted a unit that could be industry produced, easily replicated, fabricated and installed while maintaining quality standards and yet provide flexibility in spatial configuration. And when I say they wanted everything mass produced, I mean everything, from entire structural walls to door handles. So, after much deliberation, the members of Siam 2 created the first comprehensive literature on housing standards and the family housing unit affordable on a minimum wage income. Today, whenever we need to design something, we first take a look at the building standards for that particular typology. But before this, such standards did not exist. Siam 2 was one of the first to design these standards and adopt them on a big scale. The existence minimum, as many say, was Siam's most significant concept, as this was the basis of everything that came after. By the way, not everyone was on board with these standards, and with more time and research, a lot of people have criticized the methodologies and the outputs that were created. But we are getting a little ahead of ourselves. The unit was just the beginning. The members of Siam had much bigger goals in mind. Now, after you have defined a dwelling unit, you can then on to make multiple of those. This is how buildings and neighborhoods are created. And this is precisely what Siam 3 focused on. Held in Brussels in the year 1930, the agenda for this time was the design of housing settlements composed of the previously defined minimum units. At that time in Europe, the idea of the perimeter block was very popular. What that entailed was to have a whole block of buildings along its perimeter and open space in the center. The members of Siam did not like the perimeter block and they rejected it. Their reasoning was that these did not create equal access to sunlight and good ventilation in every unit. So they took another approach. The concepts and philosophies that formed the basis of existence minimum were now being considered from an urban perspective. Just like the dwelling unit, the building themselves need to be spaces that have access to fresh air, sunlight, and open and green spaces. The solution that they came up with was called Zeilenbau rows. These were basically rows of housing placed one after another, but adequately spaced to ensure enough lighting and ventilation. These fulfilled all the requirements defined by the Siam members and were able to house many more people in a given parcel of land. These would be organized into walkable neighborhood units, and each would have public amenities required by the people within that unit. The main idea was to maximize common amenities in collective housing, which in turn would minimize individual private spaces. So there was widespread agreement. These new Zeilenbau rows will become the new standard for neighborhood units. However, some of the members like Walter Gropius and Le Corbusier had another suggestion. Since the early 1880s, New York had seen the construction of high-rise elevator apartment buildings. These buildings really fascinated a lot of architects. At the Siam meeting, Walter Gropius and Le Corbusier both argued that in areas of high land costs, widely spaced housing slabs with elevators were a better housing form than the more economical four-story Zeilenbau patterns. But the thing was, not everyone agreed. There was actually a lot of debate that went on this topic. The members who were against it just didn't think that high-rises would be suitable for worker housing, and a lot of existing cities would be destroyed by introducing this. In the end, the members just couldn't see eye to eye on the high versus low debate. But in any case, they had reached a consensus about the Zeilenbau rows. These will be the building blocks of the new neighborhoods of the city. And speaking of the city, Siam 123 had laid the perfect groundwork for what was to come next. The thing that was the dream of all architects, especially in the 20th century, building the ideal city. Siam 4, where this topic was discussed, was the most influential and important of all the Siams, the one that laid the foundations of urban design for decades to come. This was the beginning of the greatest achievement this organization would ever have. But this was also the beginning of its end. It all started in a ship traveling across the Mediterranean. The year was 1933. The ship was off in the sea voyaging towards Athens, the birthplace of democracy. Aboard this ship were the members of Siam discussing the future of architecture. This would become the most important meeting of Siam and probably the most significant document ever produced by this organization, originated right here. So in this meeting, all the members produced 34 case studies of different cities in the world. Just as they had done for the dwelling units and the building layouts, these elaborate studies enabled the members to have discussions on how cities should be designed. Now, the chairman of Siam at the time was a man named Cornelius van Eesteren. He was a prominent Dutch architect and urban planner. He presented his study, which looked to the then new North American industrial cities, which were increasingly being shaped by trucks and automobiles, as the model for what he called Ein Stundes. I'm not going to try the German pronunciation. This basically means 1 hour city building. Basically, his argument was that the functional elements of the city, primarily large factories, ports, and collective recreation spaces, should be organized in relation to housing by using the most efficient transportation routes. Now, based on his approach, Siam formulated the 4 functions of the city. These were living, working, recreation, and transport. This new city model based on these fundamental functions was dubbed the functional city. This divide of 4 areas was not just an architectural strategy, but also a social one. You see, the existing cities around the world had clusters, rich and poor neighborhoods, luxurious streets, and slums. This new approach would do away with all of that. By grouping the various functions that happen within a city in these 4 categories, there would be a reduction in the class divide between the dwellers. The whole report of what it entails and how it was to be adopted was published by Le Corbusier in a document titled La Charte d'Athens. This detailed piece of writing became the holy grail for urban planners and designers. In the years that followed, as the world rebuilt itself after much of the tensions of the 20th century, the functionalist city became one of the most popular approaches to urban design. And its founding principles did make those cities better. It tended to improve housing conditions as the workers were often given better multifamily housing environments within the larger metropolitan area. When all 3, the unit, the building, and the city standards were applied together, they created city models for the metropolises of the future. Gone were the days of the dark, dingy, and damp cities of the initial industrial era. This was a new dawn. Cities would now not only be sanitary, they would be filled with happy people living their best factory girl era and singing songs into the sunset. Did I lay the sarcasm on a little too thick? Siam 4's legacy was the single most important thing to come out of the whole council. But truth be told, it had some deep-rooted problems. While on the surface everything seemed fine, there was something completely different happening in those meetings. And this holy grail for urban planners was not even voted on by the council members. You see, Siam 4 was the significant of all the meetings, but it was also the most controversial one. To understand what really happened on that ship, we need to go back to the very beginning. The 4th Siam meeting of 1933 was originally not to be held on a ship, but rather in Moscow. Now, it's hard to pinpoint why exactly this change happened, but maybe it had something to do with the fact that USSR at that time had taken out a competition for the palace of the Soviets. Le Corbusier had presented his entry, which was rejected, and that might have escalated into the change in venue. Now, of course, this reasoning is just speculation, but nevertheless, the organizers of the meeting, of which Le Corbusier was a prominent one, very last minute decided on the ship as the final venue. Also, the decision to not have it in Moscow came with certain consequences. Not only did the delegates from the USSR not participate, but any participant that were refugees in the country were also not able to join. This gave Le Corbusier and his friends a very prominent role in the 4th meeting. See, we might think of the entire Congress as this one big happy family, but it was not. Just as in the real world, politics and power plays were a big part of this organization. You remember the chairman of Siam, Cornelius van Eesteren? Well, he was only elected because Walter Gropius helped him get there. The reason I'm telling you this is so that you can understand what really went on behind the scenes. Coming to the meeting itself, remember the 34 urban analyses which were prepared by the CM members? Well, they were intended to provide an initial basis for common discussion and comparative analysis. This meeting was never to find one definite solution, but rather provide the first step in that direction. In the whole meeting, the members, even though they discussed at length the concepts of a functional city and how it would work in that era's context, they never settled on it being a concrete and rigid conclusion. The Athens chapter that people celebrated the world over and became a defining text for Siam was never voted or debated on by its members. It was independently published by Le Corbusier. And what's even more fascinating is that this charter is actually his interpretation of the meeting. He's the one who somehow single-handedly committed Siam to rigid functional cities, with citizens to be housed in high, widely spaced apartment blocks. And as you remember, even in the last Siam, the members had not even agreed on high-rise buildings. The simple fact was that the Athens Charter was just one man's interpretation. And moreover, he released it almost a decade after the actual meeting. Siam 4 happened in 1933 and the document came out in 1943. A lot of people called the charter a publicity-seeking manifesto, and the reason it got famous was because the people with influence in Siam promoted it as much as they could. The fact is that it also got closely associated with Siam, and this started to create tensions within the Congress. This was not the first time Le Corbu's initiatives and his way of doing things had irked the other members. It had been happening since the very first meeting, but this charter was a little too much. Some members started to feel that if they had opinions that differed from those in power like Le Corbu and Walter Gropius, they were somehow not just being sidelined, but downright ignored. Forget reaching a unanimous final conclusion, the members of Siam had even started debating the methodology behind the case studies. As I said, this was one of the most controversial meetings of the organization. Le Corbu's actions had made people feel that their voices, their opinions and their approaches might never get the attention they deserve. And maybe this was what finally started the end of Siam. After Siam 4, the next meeting, Siam 5, happened in Paris in 1937. The members continued their discussion on the design of a city. The main focus in this one was on dwellings and recovery. By this time, Corbusier had not published his document, but even during this meeting, it was already becoming clear that he was gradually reinterpreting the Fourth Congress's conclusions. So people already had a hint of what he was doing. As for the rest of the world, it had only started to recover from the results of the Great Depression. The economies around the world were rebuilding themselves. But then, we all know what happened next. From 1939, the World War II put the whole continent into chaos. Now till this time, the philosophies of Siam had only been adopted in a few projects around Europe. During and after the war, a number of redevelopment projects sprouted up in the continent, and the 1940s saw a sudden popularity of the Zeilenbau concept. And of course, after Le Corbusier published the Athens Charter in 1943, it was as if the world of urban design suddenly got a new doctrine. At least, it seemed that way to some people. Siam was being celebrated by some and was being resented by others. But because of the war and other political reasons, the members did not collect again for a whole decade. The next Siam meeting happened almost 10 years later in 1947 in Bridgewater. And then they kept happening every 2 years, 1949 in Italy, 1951 in England and 1953 in France. Siam 7, the one in Italy, had a main agenda of even debating how the Athens Charter could be established in practice. By this time, more and more members had started to grow away from what was being officially concluded in these meetings, especially because of the leanings of those in power. Meeting after meeting, there was a rift that just kept increasing. People had already started to break away from this organization. And guess what? Even Le Corbusier left in 1955. I know, plot twist. But this was not because he differed with the members ideologically. Clearly, he was winning on that front. But his objection was to the increasing use of English during meetings. He wanted to continue in his native language, French. Since the members did not budge, the person who started it all, who dominated most of these meetings, suddenly left, and that created a bit of a power vacuum. Since he was one of the leaders of this organization, as soon as he left, a lot of things started to change very, very quickly. Obviously, we've already discussed that the ideas put forth by Siam were not only being challenged by people around the world, but from people within the organization as well. This was especially true for the young members. They saw the world different from their aging peers, and so they formed a group inside Siam itself. They named themselves Team X. They demanded that Siam return to using the more traditional urban categories of house, street, district, and city, and at the same time offered a different kind of master planned urbanism. When Siam 10 happened in Yugoslavia in 1956, the topic of discussion was habitat. But it was in this meeting that Team X made it clear that they did not stand for the conclusions that were being drawn and the solutions that were being proposed by Siam. With rising tensions, ongoing criticisms, and the departure of Le Corbusier, this was the final nail in the coffin. 3 years later, in 1959, one final meeting was called, Siam 11 in Netherlands. This meeting was specially called by the members of Team X, and a total of 43 people attended this meeting. And the agenda was simple: the dissolution of Siam. The vote was taken and the motion passed. And just like that, almost 3 decades after it started, this International Congress of Modern Architects came to an end. Now, Siam's legacy is as controversial as the organization itself. It did bring changes to the field of architecture and urban design. From setting the minimum standards to adopting a scientific approach to design, to even attempting to create a doctrine for urban design. This organization, no doubt, had noble intentions and was able to achieve a lot in its short run. The history of architecture has rarely seen such forward-minded, enthusiastic group of people who came together despite the odds to frame and discuss how architecture is and how it should be. Especially talking about the field of urban design, the organization did revolutionize it. Two cities were actually made on the functionalist principles, Chandigarh in India and Brasilia in Brazil. Both have their drawbacks, but both are celebrated case studies in urban design. And let's not forget what this Congress was really for. They were think tanks and places for exchanging and spreading ideas of the modern movement in architecture and urban planning. And they did just that, at least in the beginning. I think one of the reasons Siam broke apart was that modernism itself was now being taken to new and opposite directions. By the 1950s, modernism had become one of the most popular movements around the world. But people who followed it took such different approaches, often completely opposite to each other. And a lot of criticism about Siam is, of course, about the whole modernism movement in general. Take, for example, the Zeilenbau Rose. To a lot of people, these look like boring, uninspired, factory-made architecture we see all around us today, with just rows of buildings one after another. But we also need to put it in a wider context to understand the motivation behind this kind of architecture. As I told you before, Siam had given us new standards, but a big role in these standards was played by politics, capitalism, and economics. These projects were funded and approved because the architects promised the politicians and the government much more housing in the same piece of land. Housing was now a product and the dweller was now a consumer. And I think this just became modernism in general. Of course, this organization was an international congress of modern architects, so any criticism applied to the movement also applies to this organization. But maybe we'll get into the details of modernism, its impact, and whether it was good or bad in another video. As far as Siam goes, I will say this though. In the following decades, the minimum dwelling unit, small, cheap, and easy to build, became the goldmine of the capitalist housing market. But when it was being implemented, Siam's original guidelines were being ignored. After the World War, people continued using the existence minimum design principles, but without considering its intrinsic initial components such as urban integration or collective living. The complex concept was also simplified to a mere reduction of domestic space and to a low-cost, full-speed production. And the use of these concepts in such a manner also led to the deterioration of the reputation of this organization. Finally, also let's talk about Team X. It actually did go on for quite a few years. While the group lacked the popularity of Siam, they were well known in the academic world for their published works and their take on functionalism. The last formal Team X meeting was held in Lisbon in the year 1981, and it just had 4 attendees. To talk of Siam is to talk of modernism. Now, I myself do have some complex and complicated thoughts about modernism in general, especially when it was applied to urban design. But I do think this movement and this organization was very, very important. It grew architects and it raised the professional practice and its standards. And I do think that sometime in the future, it might get revived again. After researching the world and trends, you understand that architectural styles usually work in a very cyclical manner. So modernism might just come back someday. But I don't know if we will ever have an organization like Siam again. At least one with that kind of influence. But maybe that's not a bad thing. I will leave that for you guys to decide. Hey guys, I hope you liked that documentary. Here on Blessedarch, I make a lot of documentaries about architecture and design, so do check them out. Also, let me know your thoughts about this one in the comments below. I love discussing ideas with my audience. Also, if you like the documentary, do consider supporting me by becoming a channel member or by using the Super Thanks feature. These documentaries take a lot of time and effort, and YouTube ad revenue is neither steady nor that much, so do consider supporting. Anyway, you can check out more such documentaries on this channel. A few of them might be showing up on your screen. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, to share it, and do subscribe to Blessedarch. I will see you guys soon with more such content. Also, if you have any specific architect or topic you want me to create a documentary on, let me know in the comments below. Until next time, bye bye.